Welcome to our investigation as to whether the media is biased. A recent joke about how the media will cover the end of the world stereotyped the nation's major newspapers, while also emphasizing their importance in reporting world events. As the story goes, the New York Times headline would be, "World Ends, Third World Hit Worst." The Washington Post front page would blare, "World Ends, Unnamed Sources Say White House Had Prior Knowledge." In the USA Today, a newspaper with a huge national and international circulation, the story would be titled, "We're Dead, State-by-State Analysis, page 4D. Sports, page 6C. In the Wall Street Journal, "World Ends, Stock Market Goes Down." Media critics today are everywhere. All of them claim that both print and electronic media exhibit bias in their reporting, in their selection of what issues to cover, and in favoring one side of an issue or one politician over another. One of the most common complaints is that the media have an ideological bias. The question of ideological bias is a long-standing complaint, is that the media, particularly big city newspapers, evidence a liberal bias. For example, former House Majority Leader Tom DeLay, a Republican from Texas, protested the liberal leanings of two of the country's major newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post, for running stories about his ethics problems. Those media, he claimed, ignored the same practices when Democrats such as Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat from California, and then House Minority Leader, engaged in those same activities. The day after, the New York Times published an article revealing that DeLay's congressional campaign had paid his wife and daughter more than $500,000 for their services, DeLay lashed out, stating that the article was just another seedy attempt by the liberal media to embarrass me. The notion that the media have a liberal bias is an often heard criticism. In 1964, former President Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his address to the Republican National Convention, condemned a liberal media bias. "My friends, we are Republicans," he said. "If there is any finer word in the field of partisan politics, I have not heard it. So let us particularly scorn the divisive efforts of those outside our family, including sensation-seeking columnists and commentators who couldn't care less about the good of our party." Many conservatives point to studies indicating that a majority of newsroom reporters identify themselves as liberal or Democrat. Conservatives charge that the ideological bent of the journalists carries through to the topics covered and to the perspectives of the stories. But studies conducted by various political scientists refute the idea that journalists' personal viewpoints tinge the content of the news in a liberal way. Indeed, studies suggest that most newspaper stories take the form of a debate, with the journalist presenting the various sides of an issue and leaving the conclusion to the reader's interpretation. Changes in the nature of the mass media have led to increasingly vocal charges, especially by Democratic elected officials, that newer media outlets, particularly talk radio and the blogosphere, are dominated by conservatives. What does the public think about partisan bias? Americans' confidence in the accuracy of the mass media has improved slightly after falling to an all-time low last year. Now, 44% say they have a great deal or fair amount of trust and confidence in the mass media, identical to 2011, but up from 40% in 2012, the lowest reading since Gallup regularly began tracking the question in 1997. The question about America's trust in mass media was asked, in general, how much trust and confidence do you have in the mass media, such as newspapers, TV, and radio, when it comes to reporting the news fully, accurately, and fairly? A great deal, a fair amount, not very much, or none at all. The latest results are based on Gallup's annual governance survey conducted September 5th through the 8th, 2013. Americans have consistently been more distrusting than trusting of the media each year since 2007. In contrast with the 1997 through 2003, when the slight majority expressed trust in the media. This year's bump in confidence comes mainly from independents and Republicans, after these groups' trust in the media dropped last year amid a heated presidential election in which Mitt Romney supporters may have felt their candidate was being treated unfairly. Democrats' confidence, however, has been inching up since 2011. Consistent with Republicans and independents' dissatisfaction with the media, far more Americans say the media are too liberal than too conservative, 46% versus 13%, as was the case in 2011 and every year since Gallup has been tracking this trend. 37% currently describe the media's political leanings as just about right. The question was asked, in general, do you think the news media are too liberal, just about right, or too conservative? Perceptions of liberal media bias are particularly strong among Republicans and conservatives, with 74% and 73% respectively saying the media are too liberal. However, half of independents also call it too liberal, while most Democrats call it just about right. The bottom line is, although up from the all-time low found last year, Americans' confidence in the mass media remains lower than it was in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Their confidence began to decline in 2005 and has been lower since. The decline over that period is apparent among Democrats, independents, and Republicans, although Democrats remain much more trusting of the media than do other groups. Democrats' higher confidence and Republicans' lower confidence in the media may be related to the media's perceived liberal leanings. Regardless of whether the media do favor a liberal point of view, the plurality of Americans perceive it does. Far fewer Americans see the media as too conservative. Let's talk about the issue of corporate bias. Most professional journalists hold journalistic objectivity to be important, and that principle well serves the interests of the large corporations that dominate the U.S. media industry today. Within the giant media conglomerates, motivated as they are by the drive for profits, there is strong disincentive for ideological bias on the part of their reporters. Newspapers and television stations rely on advertisers, and advertisers want not only to attract the largest number of readers or viewers, but also to avoid offending the largest numbers. Thus, given the corporate nature of today's media, neutrality is generally a guiding principle. Critics on the left, however, argue that these corporate structures create their own bias and that this bias has altered what is considered news and how that news is covered. Corporate bias and the desire to attract, keep, and please an audience produces skewed programming. Will corporate conglomerates be willing to report on situations that may put themselves and their advertisers in a negative light? How does the drive for profits influence what is in the news? Are viewers being fed news that is not particularly newsworthy? There is no doubt that profits influence the media to cover the kinds of stories that viewers and readers want. In particular, violence dominates most local news programming, so much so that the principle of if it bleeds, it leads now extends into the first 15 minutes of many local news broadcasts. Fires, political, sport, and sex scandals, and celebrity-heavy news are also powerful audience attractors. Why don't the media report good news is an oft-repeated question from those who feel scarred by bad publicity. Are the media biased in favor of the negative? If the sun comes up in the morning, is that news? In fact, although many individuals bemoan the emphasis on the negative, good news typically does not attract the audience that bad news does. So, is it necessary to regulate the media? The framers of the Constitution had to be concerned only with print media when they guaranteed freedom of the press, one of the fundamental liberties they ensured in the Bill of Rights. As the media evolved beyond print into electronic formats, so too did thinking about the government's role in regulating the media, especially media outlets such as radio and television stations. But technology has outpaced the ability of the government to regulate certain forms of electronic media, including the Internet and satellite radio services such as Sirius XM. Nonetheless, television and regular radio transmissions are still subject to government regulations. The government regulates and controls the ownership of radio and television stations through the independent regulatory agency as known as the FCC, or Federal Communications Commission, founded in 1934. Most of the FCC's rules have concerned ownership, such as the number of outlets a network may own. In 1996, Congress passed the Telecommunications Act, which opened the communications market to telephone companies. This sweeping law allowed competition in the communications industry. It presented new, and often confusing, options for consumers as individual companies began to offer a suite of services, from local and long-distance telephone service to internet access to cable and satellite television. With the combination of all of these services under single companies, large corporate conglomerates have increasingly gained control of the media. Firms such as Disney, Viacom, News Corporation, and Time Warner exert a powerful influence over what news the average American sees and reads on a given day. The advent of news media titans has given rise to concerns about whether this type of control will deter balanced reporting of the news and unbiased presentations of issues. In addition, public conversations about our democracy are questioning whether the relative lack of competition, because there are so few competitors, means that a valuable check on what the media do and how they do it has been lost. Congress is currently considering another question of control over the business of media. The issue, a controversial one, centers on net neutrality, the idea that the internet traffic, email, websites, videos, and phone calls, should flow through the internet pipeline without interference or discrimination by those who own or are running the pipeline. Should these broadband behemoths be able to use their market power to control information or to favor certain clients online? Critics charge that congressional passage of legislation supporting the service providers would destroy the neutrality and openness of the Internet. Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, says, "The neutral communications medium is essential to our society. It is the basis of democracy by which a community should decide what to do." Do you agree with Berners-Lee? In what ways would you say that neutral media are the bias of democracy? That should be basis of a democracy. So in conclusion of the chapter, the surge in the number and the variety of media outlets, along with the changes in the nature of the media and people's interactions with them, has affected politics and government in many ways. Once defined as a one-way relationship, the relationship between the media and consumers has evolved in unforeseen ways. Even the nature of the old media has changed, although many would ask whether the change has been for the better. On the one hand, narrowcasting and the resulting segmentation of media markets, a central feature of media growth, might raise the comfort level of many people, who no longer have to throw soft objects at their television sets in protest, but can instead pick and choose what they watch. On the other hand, media segmentation also limits the exposure of many people to new ideas. Like gated communities, segmented media are also segregated media, detached environments that expose people only to viewpoints with which they agree, thus cordoning them off from society and from many of its problems. Segmented media also confuse genuine political participation with mere ranting. After all, sounding off on a radio talk show is much easier and more entertaining than attending a zoning board meeting to fight urban congestion or becoming civically engaged in other ways. Technology has created a two-way relationship between the media and consumers, involving the exchange of seemingly limitless information in a vast conversation of democracy. The openness and easy accessibility of the new media have led to considerable criticism of them. But the good news is that almost all public, and to lesser extent private, institutions have become more transparent in recent years. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis from 1856 to 1941 once said that sunlight was the best disinfectant, that public scrutiny was the best step toward genuine reform. This two-way relationship has also meant that citizens are afforded greater opportunities to use their public voice to influence government and the policies it creates. How can this changing public voice be used in today's political arena? Can we predict the future of the media by examining the past and the present? Certainly, we can foretell increasing transparency because of the pervasive nature of today's media and the steady trend in that direction. But we cannot predict the forms media will take. What we can guarantee is continued change in the forms and usage of media, and steadily increasing access to information. Will this expanding access overload people with information? It appears that many of us are developing new skills to cope with the abundance of information, much in the way that our grandparents may have developed the skill of skimming a newspaper, selecting only those stories that matter to them. The question remains as to whether we will select only information that confirms what we already think. One trend is clear. The ever-increasing volume of information and the speed of its delivery will yield an abundance of both poor quality and high quality information. How can media consumers use the plethora of information to ensure they are receiving verifiable information? The modern media have opened the door more widely to citizens' direct participation in the democratic process. In light of Americans' high levels of cynicism about their elected leaders, might this powerful new opportunity to be heard make our democracy more participatory than the Constitution's framers ever intended or imagined? Will the availability of the Internet as a forum for citizens and a tool for organizing lead to a meaningful expansion of participation in civic life and in the conversation of democracy? Will citizens use the new technology productively?